I have stood behind this pulpit for 42 years, preaching the blood of Christ and the cleansing of sin. But 40 years ago, I watched a woman drown in the depths of Blackwater Lake and did nothing so that I could keep my hands clean for the ministry. Every Sunday, I look into the eyes of 300 people who believe I am their bridge to the Almighty. They see the silver hair, the tailored suits, and the hands that have baptized their children and buried their parents. They don't see the silt. They don't see the dark, stagnant water that fills my lungs every time I close my eyes to pray. It was August 1986. The air in East Texas doesn't just sit. It weighs on you like a wet wool blanket. I was 28 years old, the golden boy of the Southern Baptist Convention, already tipped to take over my father's massive congregation. I had the voice, I had the fire, and I had Sarah. Sarah wasn't my wife. Mary was at home, pregnant with our first, sewing nursery curtains and humming hymns. Sarah was the girl from the roadside diner outside of Lufkin, a girl with smoke in her hair and a laugh that made me forget every commandment I'd ever memorized. That night the sky was bruised purple, heavy with a coming storm. We were in my father's Oldsmobile, the engine humming a low rhythmic growl. I had a flask of cheap bourbon in the glove box. I wasn't a drinker, not officially, but the pressure of being the anointed one was a cage, and the bourbon was the only key I had. We were driving too fast on the back roads near the levee. The tires screamed on the gravel. Sarah was leaning out the window, her hair whipping like a dark flag in the wind, screaming into the night that she loved me. I remember the smell of her, cloves and sweat. Then the deer stepped out, a flash of tan hide, a pair of glowing eyes. I jerked the wheel. The car didn't just slide, it took flight. The world turned upside down. Glass exploded like diamonds in the dark. Metal shrieked against the trunk of a cypress tree. And then, the most terrifying sound I have ever heard. The splash. The water was instant. It was black and cold, rushing through the shattered windows like a living thing. I was pinned against the door, the steering column crushing my ribs. I gasped, and my mouth filled with the metallic taste of lake water and blood. Sarah was on the passenger side. The car was tilting nose down, sinking into the soft, hungry mud of the lake bed. Thomas, she choked out. She was alive. Her head was barely above the rising water line. Her hand reached out, fingers clawing at the dashboard, looking for mine. I managed to kick my door open. The pressure was immense, but the frame was bent just enough. I spilled out into the weeds and the muck, coughing, shivering, my heart hammering against my chest like a trapped bird. I stood on the bank, knee-deep in the slime of the shore. The car's taillights were still glowing underwater, two dim red eyes staring back at me from the abyss. "Thomas, help me, the door is stuck. It won't move." Her voice was thin. It was high-pitched, like a child's. I took a step toward the water. I saw her face pressed against the rear window. Her eyes were wide, frantic. She was slamming her fist against the glass. And that was when the thought entered my mind. It wasn't a slow realization. It was a bolt of lightning. If I save her, the police will come. They will smell the bourbon. They will see the girl who isn't my wife. They will see the candidate for the pulpit, the son of the great reverend, disgraced. My life would be over. My father's legacy would be ash. Mary would be a laughingstock. I stopped walking. Thomas, what are you doing? Break the glass, please. I watched her. I watched the red lights of the car sink deeper, 1 foot, 2 feet. The water was up to her chin now. She had to tilt her head back just to breathe. She stopped screaming for help. She just looked at me. Through the glass and the dark water, she looked right into my soul. I didn't move. I stood there and I calculated. I weighed her life against my career. I weighed her breath against my reputation. And the scale tipped. I turned my back. I heard the last muffled thud against the glass. I heard a gargled sound, a final desperate attempt to hold on to the world. And then the silence of the Texas woods returned, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant roll of thunder. The red lights went out. I walked 3 miles in the dark, avoiding the main road. I reached the back of the parsonage, stripped off my ruined clothes, and buried them in the compost heap behind the shed. I showered until my skin was raw, scrubbing away the smell of the lake. Then I sat in my study, opened my Bible to the Psalms, and waited for the sun to rise. I went to the 6 a.m. prayer breakfast. I shook hands, I smiled, I prayed for the sick. When Sarah was reported missing 3 days later, I was the first one to offer the diner owner a shoulder to cry on. I organized a prayer vigil for the lost soul. For 40 years, I thought the lake had swallowed my sin. I thought the mud was deep enough to hold a secret forever. But this summer, the drought came. The water level in Blackwater Lake has dropped 20 feet. And yesterday, a fisherman found something sticking out of the mud near the old levee. A rusted roof of an Oldsmobile. The mud has a memory, and it is finally screaming my name. I was sitting in my study, the mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine, when the phone rang. It was Sheriff Miller, a man I've baptized, a man who sits in the third pew every Sunday and nods at my every word. Thomas, he said, his voice thick with a strange kind of reverence. We found it, the car from the '86 disappearance, the lake, it's giving up its ghosts. I didn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were filled with cold, wet silt. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Jim, I forced out. My voice was steady. It was the voice of a man of God. It was a lie I've been perfecting for 4 decades. May the family owned peace. But there is no peace for me. There hasn't been a moment of real silence since that night. I remember the sound of the mud sucking at my shoes as I walked away from the water. I remember the way the crickets seemed to stop chirping, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for me to do the right thing. I never did. I drove out to the levee that afternoon. I had to. It was what a good shepherd would do. Be there for the community, offer a prayer over the wreckage. The heat was a physical weight, 104 degrees, shimmering off the parched lake bed. The water had retreated so far, it looked like a scar on the earth. And there it was. The Oldsmobile. It looked like a skeletal ribcage rising from the muck. The blue paint was gone, replaced by a crust of brown filth and rusted iron. The windows were gone, blown out by the pressure or the time. I looked at the driver's side where I had escaped. Then I looked at the passenger side. A yellow tarp was draped over the frame. The forensics team was moving slowly, their white suits stark against the brown landscape. They weren't just looking for a car, they were looking for her. Tragic thing, Miller said, walking up beside me. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a stained handkerchief. 40 years of wondering where she went. Everyone thought she just ran off, ran away from a life she didn't want. People are fragile, I whispered. Sin leads them down dark paths. I was talking about her, but I was thinking about myself. I was thinking about the flask, the glass flask with my father's initials on it. I hadn't thought about it in years. I had forgotten it was in the glove box. If the metal hadn't corroded, if the leather wrap preserved the engraving. My pulse was a hammer in my neck. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jumped, nearly stumbling into the mud. It was Mary, my wife. She stood there in her Sunday dress, despite it being a Tuesday. She looked at the car with an expression I couldn't decipher. She's been the perfect pastor's wife for 40 years, silent, supportive, the pillar of the ladies' auxiliary. "It's a terrible day for the town, Thomas," she said. Her voice was as cold as the lake water used to be. "But the truth always finds a way to the surface, doesn't it?" She looked at me then, not with the devotion she shows in the pews, but with something else, something sharp. I realized then that there was a hidden truth I had buried even deeper than the car. That night in 1986, when I returned home, I told Mary I had been out praying in the woods. I told her I had tripped and fallen into a creek. She had looked at my bleeding hands and my shivering frame, and she had nodded. She had cleaned the mud off the floor. She had burnt my clothes before I even woke up the next morning. I had convinced myself she believed my lie because she needed to believe it. But standing there on the edge of that dying lake, watching them lift the yellow tarp, I saw the truth in the lines around her eyes. She didn't believe me. She never did. Thomas, she whispered, leaning closer so the sheriff couldn't hear. The police found something else in the mud, not just a car. I felt the world tilt. "What?" I choked out. "A locket," she said. "Oh, gold with a picture inside. They're cleaning it now." I remember that locket. Sarah wore it every day. It was a cheap thing, but she cherished it. She told me once it held the only thing that mattered to her. I had assumed it was a picture of her mother. The sheriff called out to us. "Reverend, could you come here? We need a prayer. We found the remains." I walked toward the wreckage on trembling legs. The smell hit me first. Even after 40 years, the mud didn't smell like earth. It smelled like decay. It smelled like the breath of a woman who had spent her last seconds screaming for a man who didn't exist. I looked down into the passenger seat. Among the silt and the tangled weeds, I saw the bones, small, fragile. They were still buckled in. She had stayed right where I left her. But as the technician brushed away the last of the grime from the floorboard, he stopped. "Wait," he said. "There's something else here, below the seat." He reached in with a pair of long tweezers and pulled out a small metallic object. It wasn't my flask. It was a set of keys, house keys, with a keychain that featured a small porcelain angel, the kind we gave out at the church youth group in 1985. My breath hitched. Sarah never went to our church. She hated the hypocrites in ties, as she called them. She shouldn't have had those keys. I looked back at Mary. She was smiling, a tiny, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a woman who has held a knife to a man's throat for 40 years without him ever feeling the blade. I retreated to the sanctuary, the heavy oak doors groaning as they closed behind me. The smell of floor wax and old hymnals usually brings me peace, but today it felt like the inside of a coffin. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceiling, and I looked up at the stained glass Christ. He looked back with eyes of colored glass, cold, unblinking, and utterly silent. The keys, the porcelain angel. I remember the day I lost them. It was a week before that night in August. I had been at the diner, sitting in a back booth, sliding my hand under the table to touch Sarah's knee while the locals drank their coffee 10 feet away. I thought I'd dropped them in the parking lot. I told Mary I misplaced them at the grocery store. If Sarah had them, if she had them in her pocket or on the floorboard, it meant she had been in my house, or it meant I had given them to her. But I hadn't. I was a sinner, but I wasn't a fool. I never would have given a girl like Sarah a way into my sanctuary. You're shaking, Thomas. Mary was standing by the altar. She hadn't made a sound. She was holding a silver tray with a pitcher of water and a single glass. The ice clinked, a sharp, brittle sound that made my teeth ache. It's the heat, I lied. The drought is getting to everyone. Is it? She asked. She walked toward me, her heels clicking like a metronome. Or is it the fact that the sheriff is asking why a diner waitress from Lufkin was carrying the keys to the Reverend's private residence? The air left my lungs. I don't know what you're talking about, Mary. She stopped in front of me. She's shorter than I am, but in that moment she felt like a giant. She reached out and adjusted my collar, her fingers cold against my skin. I found those keys in your coat pocket the night you came home wet, Thomas. I froze. The memory of that night shifted. I saw myself stumbling through the back door. I saw her standing there with a towel. I saw her taking my jacket. I didn't think much of it then, she continued, her voice a calm, rhythmic drone. I thought you'd just been careless, but then I saw you on the news 3 days later praying for the missing girl. And I saw the way your hands trembled when her name was mentioned. She smiled again, that same thin, terrible line. I went to the lake that night, Thomas, before the police, before anyone. I knew where you'd been. I'd followed you more than once. My heart was thundering so loud I was sure it would burst through my ribs. You went there? I whispered. I stood on the bank, she said. The car was already mostly under. I could hear her. She was still tapping on the glass. It was a very quiet sound, like a woodpecker. Tap, tap, tap. I felt the bile rise in my throat. I had left her there, but I had thought I was the only witness. I had lived for 40 years, believing my secret was a solitary burden. Why didn't you help her? I choked out. If you were there, if you saw. Mary tilted her head, looking at me with genuine curiosity. And ruin your career, our life, the ministry? No, Thomas. I did what a good wife does. I waited until the tapping stopped. Then I walked down to the water, threw your keys through the broken window into the muck, and came home to make you some tea. I backed away from her, my knees hitting the front pew. I collapsed onto the cushioned wood. She had framed me. Even then, 40 years ago, she was making sure she owned me. She didn't save Sarah because Sarah was a threat to her position. And she kept the secret because it gave her power over the great man of God. The sheriff is coming back tonight, Mary said, turning to walk away. They opened the locket. The picture inside, it wasn't her mother, Thomas. She paused at the door of the vestry, looking back over her shoulder. It was a sonogram, dated August 12th, 1986. She was coming to the parsonage that night to tell you she was 3 months along. She wasn't just a girl from a diner. She was the mother of your firstborn son. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat in the dark of my own church, surrounded by the symbols of a God I had mocked with every breath for 4 decades, my son. I hadn't just watched a woman die. I had watched my own blood drown in the dark. The light through the stained glass began to fade as the sun dipped below the horizon. The shadows of the cypress trees outside stretched across the floor like long black fingers reaching for me. I heard a car pull into the gravel driveway, heavy footfalls on the porch, a knock on the door, sharp, authoritative, and final. Reverend, Miller's voice called out. We need to talk. We found something else in that car, something we can't explain. I looked at the altar. I looked at the cross. I thought about the mud. I thought about the way the water felt in Sarah's lungs. And I realized that the nightmare was only just beginning. The sheriff stepped into the sanctuary, his boots heavy and rhythmic against the wood, a sound like a gavel striking a block over and over again. He didn't look like the man who shared coffee with me at the Sunday social. He looked like an avatar of judgment, his face etched with a grim, hollow exhaustion. Reverend, he said, stopping at the edge of the shadow cast by the pulpit, we got the preliminary report from the state techs. They hauled the car to the impound in Lufkin. I gripped the edge of the pew so hard the wood groaned. I looked over at Mary. She was sitting in the front row now, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of serene, terrifying patience. She looked like a saint waiting for her crown. And, I asked, my voice was a ghost of itself. The car wasn't in gear, Thomas Miller said. He pulled a plastic evidence bag from his pocket. Inside was a small, twisted piece of metal. The transmission was in park, and the emergency brake was pulled so tight the cable snapped from the rust while we were winching it out. I stared at the bag. What does that mean, Jim? It means that car didn't slide off the road, the sheriff said, his voice dropping an octave. It means it was sitting on a bank, stationary, and then it was pushed. The room began to spin. I remembered the deer. I remembered the swerve. I remembered the sensation of flight. But as I looked at the sheriff's face, a new memory, a sharper, colder memory, began to claw its way through the bourbon-soaked fog of 1986. I wasn't behind the wheel when the car went into the water. I remember the taste of the dirt. I had vomited in the grass. I had passed out next to the cypress tree, the world a whirling kaleidoscope of trees and stars. I remembered a pair of headlights approaching from the road. I remembered the sound of a second car door closing. I remembered the slow, steady creak of the Oldsmobile's frame as it began to roll toward the edge. "There's more," Miller said. "We found the driver's side door handle. It didn't just break in the crash. It was jammed from the outside with a tire iron. Someone made sure nobody was getting out of that car, Thomas. Not Sarah, and not the driver." I looked at Mary. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just watched me with those wide, pale eyes. "Or did you just wake up wet on the shore, Thomas? Do you actually remember the water in your lungs? Or do you just remember me telling you how lucky you were that you crawled out?" The sheriff's eyes darted between us. He wasn't stupid. He'd lived in this town long enough to know that the holiest houses hold the deepest rot. "There was a second set of prints found in the mud, preserved under a flat stone near the levee," Miller said. "A woman's shoe, small, a Sunday heel." He stepped closer to Mary. "The kind of shoe you were wearing at the prayer breakfast the next morning, Mary. I remember because you'd scuffed the heel so badly you were limping." Mary stood up. She smoothed her skirt with a slow, deliberate motion. "I was looking for my husband," she said. "I knew he was with that creature. I went to bring him home, to save his soul, to save this church." She turned to me, and for the first time in 40 years, the mask fell away completely. There was no love in her face. There was only the cold, hard vacuum of possession. "I found you passed out in the passenger seat, Thomas, with her. She was laughing. Even with the car stopped on the edge of the levee, she was laughing at me. She told me she was going to take everything, the parsonage, the respect, the child." Mary took a step toward the altar. "I didn't push the car because I hated her, Thomas. I pushed it because I loved God, and God needed you to be the man you are today. He needed a vessel, and I made sure the vessel was empty of her." The sheriff reached for his handcuffs. "Mary Jenkins, I'm going to have to ask you to come down to the station." Mary didn't look at him. She looked at me. "You won't let him do that, Thomas," she said. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. "Because if I go, I'd take the locket with me, the one the police haven't opened yet." The sheriff froze. "What are you talking about?" "We have the locket." "No," Mary whispered, her eyes locked on mine. "You have the locket Sarah was wearing. You don't have the one I took off her neck before the water reached her face. The one that contains the letter she wrote to the deacon board. The one that details exactly where the church's building fund went in the summer of '85 to pay for her discretion." The silence that filled the sanctuary was not holy. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of 40 years of lies collapsing all at once. Sheriff Miller looked at me, then at Mary, his hand hovering near his belt. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of this soil, a man who had been raised to believe that the Jenkins family was as close to divine as a mortal could get. "Thomas," Miller said, his voice cracking, "is she telling the truth about the building fund, about the hush money?" I couldn't answer. I didn't know. I had spent 4 decades so buried in my own guilt that I never looked at the ledgers. I never questioned why my father had left us so little, or why Mary was the one who handled every cent that passed through our doors. Mary walked toward the sheriff, her hand reaching out as if to comfort him, but her eyes never left mine. "Jim, put the cuffs away," she said softly. "You know as well as I do what happens to this town if the church falls. The schools, the charities, the very spirit of the county. It's all built on the Reverend's name." "Mary, she's dead," Miller whispered. "A woman and a child are in that mud because of what happened that night." "Because of an accident," Mary corrected. "An accident involving a car that rolled while the driver was incapacitated. A tragic 40-year-old secret that serves no one today." I looked at the locket in Miller's hand, the one they had already opened, the one Sarah had been wearing when she died. "Let me see it, Jim," I said. My voice was cold. It was the voice of a man who had already lost his soul and had nothing left to fear. Miller hesitated, then dropped the small, rusted piece of jewelry into my palm. It was cold, still caked with a fine layer of gray silt. I pried it open with a trembling thumbnail. I expected to see the sonogram. I expected to see the proof of my own sin. But there was no sonogram. Inside the locket was a photograph, trimmed to fit the small oval frame. It was a man. He was younger, his hair dark, his jawline sharp, standing in front of this very pulpit. It wasn't me. It was my father. The great Reverend Elias Jenkins, the man who had built this sanctuary, the man who had preached against the fires of hell until his heart gave out in the middle of a baptism. The room felt like it was tilting. Sarah wasn't coming for me that night. The discretion Mary mentioned, it wasn't mine. The child in her womb wasn't my son. It was my brother. I looked at Mary. She was watching me, her expression unreadable. She knew. She had always known. "You told me it was mine," I whispered. "You told me I was the one who ruined her." Mary stepped closer, her voice a low, rhythmic hiss. "I gave you a legacy, Thomas. I took a weak, drunken boy and I gave him a throne. I made you believe you were a monster so that you would spend the rest of your life trying to be a saint. And you did it. You became the man this church needed." "You killed her to protect a dead man's name?" I roared, the sound echoing through the rafters. "I killed her to protect your name," she snapped back. "If she had arrived that night, the scandal would have destroyed Elias, yes, but it would have destroyed you too. You were the heir. You were the golden boy. I wasn't going to let a diner girl take away the life I had spent years planning." She turned to the sheriff, who was standing frozen, his world view fracturing in real time. "Jim, take the car, take the remains. Tell the press it was a tragic accident. An old car, a slick road, a girl who lost control 40 years ago. If you don't, I start talking about the money your father borrowed from the mission fund to pay off his gambling debts in Shreveport. Money I helped him hide." Sheriff Miller looked at me, a silent plea in his eyes. He wanted me to be the man he thought I was. He wanted me to tell him to do the right thing. I looked down at the image of my father in the locket, the man I had spent my life trying to emulate, the man who was just as hollow, just as rotten as I was, And I looked at Mary, the architect of my entire existence, the woman who had pushed a car into a lake and then came home to make me tea. I could feel the silt in my throat. I could feel the water rising. "Go home, Jim," I said. My voice was dead. It was an accident, just like she said. The sheriff stood there for a long moment, the plastic bag with the tire iron crinkling in his grip. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the sanctuary. The heavy doors closed with a final echoing thud. Mary reached out and took the locket from my hand. She tucked it into her pocket. "Good man," she whispered, patting my cheek. "Now go to your study. You have a sermon to write for Sunday. I believe the topic is forgiveness." She walked away, her footsteps light and brisk, while heading toward the back of the church to check on the flower arrangements for the morning service. I stood alone in the dark. I walked up to the pulpit and looked out over the empty pews. I saw the ghosts of 3 generations of people who had come here for truth, only to be fed the beautiful manicured lies of the Jenkins family. I thought about Sarah. I thought about the child who would have been my brother. I thought about the tapping on the glass, the sound I had spent 40 years hearing in my dreams. The sound Mary had stood on the bank and listened to until it stopped. I am 68 years old. I have everything a man could want: wealth, respect, power, and I have never been more alone. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the old silver flask. It wasn't my father's initials on it. It was mine. I unscrewed the cap and took a long, burning swallow of the bourbon I had hidden there for decades. The lake water may have dried up, but the mud is still there. It's in my mouth. It's in my heart. And come Sunday morning, I will stand before them all, and I will tell them exactly what they want to hear. Because the truth doesn't set you free. The truth just makes the cage smaller.